Dr. Adam Day is head of the Geneva office of the United Nations University Center for Policy Research. He's now joining us live from Geneva, Switzerland. Doctor, great to have you on the show. Welcome to We On World is One.
Thanks so much, Eric. It's great to be on your show.
Doctor, Israel is getting a lot of flack both from within and around the world after soldiers admitted to have mistakenly killed hostages in Gaza. Some may not see it now, but how damaging could this action be on the part of Israel in this war?
I think it's an incredibly important moment, Eric, and I think it points to the enormous pressure that's growing on Israel domestically and internationally and on the U.S. And it's one of many tragedies that are unfolding in Gaza, including the killing of 8,000 Palestinian children. And I think you see that language coming in President Biden's comments about indiscriminate bombing. You mentioned Jake Sullivan's trip, too. I think part of that trip was really about how to shift Israel's approach in this military operation. You hear about more precise ways of targeting Hamas leadership. You see this trying to push for a less intense version of this military operation. I think one of the challenges, though, is as the pressure grows on both Israel and the U.S. to shift gears, there isn't a clear next step where you see an alignment growing out of Jake Sullivan's trip to Israel in terms of timeline, in terms of intensity, or in terms of how they're going to respond to this pressure.
Doctor, we'll talk about Jake Sullivan's visit in a short while, but this incident has raised doubts and even worries about hostage safety. Again, with the soldiers admitting that some may have escaped from captivity, how can the safety of the remaining hostages be ensured, if at all?
Well, I think the very short answer is it can't. And as long as the hostages remain in custody, as long as this remains a hot conflict, I think there's no way to guarantee their safety. And that's one of the problems. The solution would be another pause. I know that there are negotiations happening behind the scenes to try to get that pause, which did succeed in mid-November in getting hostages released. I don't think there's a scenario where a military operation can free all of those hostages safely. I think all sides understand that. And so really the answer comes in some form of either a pause or a ceasefire. That's the best way to guarantee their safety. I don't think there are any other options right now in the short term.
All right, let's talk about Jake Sullivan now, who is the U.S. National Security Advisor. He was in Israel and urged the government to lower the intensity of military campaign in Gaza. What do you read from his statement? Some say the U.S. could be giving hints that the issue of Palestine will stay. Is that the case?
I think it was very clear that for the U.S. position, that the question of Palestine, that you hear Jake speaking about a two-state solution, even though you see pressure back from the Israeli government really on using the language of a two-state solution. You see some even very senior members of the Israeli government saying that Oslo may have been a mistake. I think this points to a real rift in the narrative that we haven't seen it so clearly before, where I think the U.S. position, the UN position remains aligned with some form of a two-state solution. But I think that that's a very unpopular sentiment right now. And within Israel, I think that may have shifted now to more public statements saying that that isn't something that they can consider now. And it may be a short-term issue where you hear the president of Israel saying we need time to grieve and please don't use this language. In the short term, it may be that the two-state solution, the issue of Palestine, can come back onto the table. But right now, it's a very worrying moment where the narratives of the U.S. and Israel are quite different. And I don't see an immediate bridge back into a clear common narrative or vision for what the day after Gaza will look like. And that's really the most important question in the longer term, which is how do you create a process that will get us from a hot military operation to a political process and a Palestinian process too, to decide leadership and how to move forward.
Doctor, let's talk about the confrontation in Israel's border in the north. The IDF is dropping leaflets in South Lebanon. Do you foresee or think Israel is preparing to expand the war?
Well, When I used to look much more closely, and when I lived in Lebanon, we would look at scenarios for potential escalation. And certainly this scenario is very, very high on the list of likely escalation scenarios where the intensity of conflict within Israel can create a spillover. My sense is if there was an escalation across the border into the north, it would be an unintentional one. I don't think that Hezbollah has the intention of bringing the conflict directly into Israel. I don't think Israel wants to have 2 or 3 fronts going when so much of their resources are focused on Gaza. So I think right now they're doing those leaflets, they're doing those activities on the border largely to try to dissuade further action. I don't see the intention of either Israel or Hezbollah or other actors, including Iran, to escalate there. That doesn't mean it won't happen. And 2006 should be clearly in our minds as a miscalculation. And the possibility of unintentional escalation is very real. You have 100,000 rockets north of the border, strategic weapons north of the border, and really a very high risk that something could happen without the intention of either side for that escalation.
Dr. Adam, finally, and please make it brief, we've seen various resolutions being vetoed or passed in the United Nations Security Council. Many say that they've lost hope in the United Nations. What do you make of that statement that the world has lost faith in the United Nations and they think that the United Nations will not bring peace in Israel and Gaza?
Well, certainly the United Nations by itself won't bring peace. I think the vote this week with 153 member states in support of a ceasefire shows that the international consensus is there. I also think it's worth noting that the UN is already in Gaza. There are a lot of resources there, and I think that it offers something to build on. There are no good outcomes, no good scenarios, no silver bullets, but I do think some combination of the UN plus Arab neighbors plus potentially some other actors coming together to find a transition plan is probably the only of several bad options. And so the loss of confidence is, I think, mainly a loss of confidence in Israel and the U.S. and the Palestinian leadership to find a solution. And I think that puts greater emphasis on the UN stepping in a more leadership role. And I think you see the SG in triggering Article 99 saying it's now time to really put this at the top of the international agenda.
All right, I've been talking to Dr. Adam Day, who's the head of the Geneva office of the United Nations University Center for Policy Research. Dr. Adam, thank you very much for talking to us today.
Thank you, Eric.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.